The north is cold and full of whispers.
The candle had burned to half its height before Ned stopped reading, not because the words were difficult. The words were simple. The High Septon Maynard's registry, pulled from the dustiest corner of the tower's legal archive, written in a clerk's precise and indifferent hand, was the most lucid document Ned Stark had ever wished he'd never found. An annulment, a remarriage, performed in 281 AC by a Septon who had been dead for 13 years. No witnesses named. No record filed in the public index. It had been placed in a ledger of minor liturgical ceremonies from the same year, buried not by malice but by bureaucracy, which was the more permanent hiding place. The second document was shorter, half a page, the bottom edge torn where Howland Reed had cut it before forwarding. Ned had received it 2 months ago and had not opened it until tonight. He had held it in the locked chest beside his writing table for 2 months and looked at it every morning and put off the opening, because he knew whose handwriting was on the outside and he had been afraid of what he'd find. Lyanna's hand. He'd know it anywhere. He had read it twice, 3 sentences and 1 name. He set both documents down and stared at the candle. Robert's order to kill Daenerys Targaryen sat beside them. The wax seal still carried the faint warmth of morning when it had been placed in Ned's hands. Kill the girl. Kill her unborn child. Kill them before they can become a problem. Robert had not lowered his voice when he said it. He had said it the way men ordered wine when they were not enjoying the vintage but were going to keep drinking anyway. Ned had resigned the handship over it. He had handed back the badge and walked out and told himself that was the clean thing, the honorable thing, and that refusing the order and going home was protection. That absence was a kind of wall. He understood now, sitting in the Tower of the Hand at the 3rd hour of the morning with 2 pieces of paper in front of him, that he had been wrong. Robert killed Targaryens. It was not policy that required evidence or deliberation or a specific grievance. It was instinct, ground into him over 17 years on a throne he had built on grief, on rage, on a story about a woman who had not waited for him. Kill the girl. Kill the child. Kill anyone with Targaryen blood, because Targaryen blood was the thing that had taken her. And if someone found the registry in the archive, and someone would find it eventually, because secrets held by Septon ledgers and hands offices were not protected by intent, only by time and luck, the boy would not die as a bastard forgotten in the north. He would die as a Targaryen heir. Robert's executioner's block was not a contingency. It was standing policy. Ned had spent 15 years believing silence was a wall. Tonight he understood that silence was only darkness. Things moved in darkness. The wall did not exist. He made himself run through every option without sentiment. His father had taught him to do it this way. List the facts, list what each fact produced, and do not let the heart vote until the mind was done. Leave. Go home. Tell no one. Hope the record stayed buried and Robert never ordered another sweep of the archive, and Littlefinger never went looking for leverage, and no one across 17 years and the whole of Westeros ever connected the bastard of Winterfell to the documents that could end him. He had done that for 15 years. The secret had held only because no one had yet thought to look. That was not a wall, that was luck dressed up as strategy, and Ned Stark had never trusted luck with anything that mattered. Tell Robert. He sat with that one longer than the others, pictured Robert's face as it would look when he received the information, not the Robert who had stood at Lyanna's grave and wept without shame, but the Robert who had signed a girl's death warrant before his morning meal, the Robert whose love had curdled into something that wore love's name and looked nothing like it. Jon Snow would be dead before dawn. The third option sat in front of him like a locked door with no visible keyhole. It required things Ned Stark had spent his life not doing. It required deception, manipulation, the deliberate use of other people's weaknesses as instruments. He turned it over and examined it from every side, and when he was done he understood that there was no version of it that left his hands clean. There was only the version where Lyanna's son lived and the version where he didn't. He chose. He sent for Patyr Baelish at the 5th hour. Littlefinger arrived looking as he always looked, entirely awake and entirely composed, dressed as though he had expected to be called, which was a performance he maintained with such consistency that it had begun to resemble truth. He sat without being invited, crossed one knee over the other, arranged his expression into the small smile that suggested he already knew everything, because suggesting knowledge was cheaper than having it. Ned did not offer him wine. "I have been reviewing the Crown accounts," Ned said, "in my capacity as Hand. Of course, Littlefinger's smile did not move. The Master of Coin's office has been creative in its management of certain revenues. The line between crown funds and personal ventures has been— Ned paused, elastic. Something shifted in Littlefinger's eyes. Not the smile. The smile was professional. It would stay until he died. But the eyes recalculated, rapid and precise. The way a man recalculated when the ground he thought was solid produced a sound beneath his foot. Financial records are complex things, Littlefinger said. A man without the full context might misread perfectly sound instruments as something considerably less sound. He might, Ned said. A man with the full context might find them interesting. Silence, not the performed kind, the functional kind between two people who had just located each other's leverage and were deciding what to do with the discovery. Littlefinger said, "What is it you want, Lord Stark?" The direct question meant the leverage was real. Ned had prepared for this. The moment Baelish stopped performing and asked plainly because the answer was worth more than the appearance of confidence, men only dropped the performance when the stakes demanded efficiency. "One night," Ned said. "Tonight, the Harbor District. I am leaving King's Landing quietly. I have resigned the handship. I want no spectacle. I am loading my daughters and some effects onto a ship before dawn, and I would like the City Watch to have other priorities this evening." Littlefinger looked at him with the careful attention of a man who never looked at anything without auditing it first. He read the situation. Ned Stark, honorable, rigid, the man who had never once asked a favor of Patyr Baelish in their entire acquaintance, sitting across a table asking to be allowed to retreat without witnesses, asking to be smoothed out of a city he'd never wanted into, asking the man he'd spent years looking through, not at. He read it as cowardice. He read it as Ned Stark finally understanding that the world ran on transactions, and coming at the cost of everything it cost him, to the one man in King's Landing who had always understood that. He read it as winning. "I'll send word to Janos," Littlefinger said. He rose. He did not wait to be thanked because men like Littlefinger knew that gratitude was a tell, and Ned offering it would have read his performance. He left. Ned waited 20 minutes, then he sent for 3 City Watch captains, not Slint's men. The 3 who had served Jon Arryn for the better part of a decade and had watched the Gold Cloaks sell their loyalty piece by piece under Lannister money and had not been offered enough to join it. He told them, formally, with the hand seal displayed, he was executing a crown transfer and they were to ensure the Harbor District remained unimpeded through the night. Official. Specific. Nothing to question, because the hand of the king's business was beyond their authority to question. They accepted. They would not interfere with what Littlefinger's men were told to ignore. Men who had been abandoned by their commanders did not need convincing. They only needed an authority that still meant something. He wrote the Raven himself, 3 words, routed through an old maester at Seaguard, a man who had served House Mallister for 30 years and owed Jon Arryn more than he had ever been called to repay. The Raven was addressed to Greywater Watch. The wolf runs. Find the cub. He did not know if it would arrive in time. He did not know if Howland was positioned to act. He did not know whether any of this would hold. He had built a plan from available materials in a single night, and there were gaps in it wide enough to lose everything, and he had no time to close them. He was a man who had always wanted more certainty than the world provided. Tonight the world was providing none, and he was going anyway. He burned the second copy of the registry, kept the original on his person in a field dispatch pouch, the kind soldiers carried, small enough to disappear under a riding cloak. He burned the draft to Seaguard. He burned the working notes from the options. He burned Lyanna's letter last. He held it at the candle's edge and watched it take. The corner went first, then the words, the 3 sentences and the one name, thinning into black curl as the flame moved through them. He did not look away. He owed it to her not to look away. The paper turned to nothing. The candle guttered in the draft from the window. The room was dark and very still and smelled of smoke. Ned Stark sat in the dark and did not move. He had just done what he had always condemned. He told himself there was a distinction. That deception in service of the innocent was not the same as the deceptions that had made lesser men into worse men. That the means were not the measure if the thing protected was worth protecting. He told himself this carefully. He was not certain he believed it. He thought he might spend a long time not being certain. He told himself, one other thing. Quietly, the way you told yourself the things that were true when there was no one to hear them. Lyanna died for this boy. She died asking me to keep him safe. I will not let her down again. He stood. He went to wake his daughters. Sir Roderick Castle woke Arya first, hand over mouth, 2 fingers raised. The old signal, the one Ned had taught the household guard for night movements in the field. Arya's eyes opened, and her hand moved before the rest of her was conscious, fingers closing around Needle's grip in the dark beside her bed. Sir Roderick watched this happen and said nothing. He had known this girl since she could walk. He was not surprised. She dressed without being told. No questions. She read the room, Sir Roderick's expression, the hour, the absence of light under the door, and processed what it meant with the efficiency of a child who had always paid more attention to the world than the world expected of her. Sansa was harder. She had arranged her chamber the way she arranged everything in this city, carefully, deliberately, with an eye toward the version of her life she had been building since the king's party arrived at Winterfell. Joffrey's embroidered favor was folded on the writing table, beside a half-drafted letter to Septim Dayne. The dress she'd chosen for tomorrow's breakfast was hung on the frame by the window. The life she wanted was organized neatly in this room, and Ned was about to take it apart. He did not soften it. He sat on the edge of her bed and spoke low and even, and did not reach for her hand, because reaching for her hand would have made it a comfort, and it was not a comfort. It was a fact. "If we stay," he said, "you marry Joffrey. If we stay and I die, you are his property for whatever years he sees fit. You will smile at his cruelties and produce his heirs and spend your life making yourself small enough not to provoke him. That is the future in this room." Sansa stared at him. Her face moved through things he could not name. Grief, fury, the particular devastation of a person who had built something in their mind with great care and watched it removed without their permission. "Come now," Ned said. Sansa came. She brought nothing. Ned had told Ser Roderick, traveling clothes, 1 bag each, nothing identifiable. She wore a traveling cloak over her nightgown, and her hair was still loose, and she was furious in the specific silent way of Tully women, which was a fury that did not raise its voice because it did not need to, and Ned respected it even as he refused to answer it. The servants' passages of the Tower of the Hand ran behind the public corridors, narrow and unlit, designed for staff who were meant to move without being seen. Ned had memorized them over 6 months in office, not from paranoia, but from the habit of a man who had always believed that knowing the shape of a place was the same as knowing what it might require of you. He knew which steps creaked. He knew where the passage widened at the junction near the kitchens, and where it narrowed to single file approaching the east gate. Arya moved through the dark like she had grown up in it. Sansa kept one hand on Ned's cloak and did not speak. The East Gate guard was one of the 3 Sir Roderick had spoken with 2 days before, a broad man named Tomard who had come north with Ned's household from Winterfell and had spent 6 months in King's Landing developing a quiet, personal dislike of everything south of the Neck. He opened the small door cut into the gate's base without a word and closed it behind them without looking back. The street of silk was empty. It smelled the way all of King's Landing smelled at the 5th hour, of last night's fires and the river and the accumulated refuse of a city that had always housed more people than its planning accounted for. Their footsteps were the only sound. North to the Street of Copper, right at the candlemaker's workshop, where the sign had been broken for as long as Ned had lived in this city. Left at the fountain that hadn't run water since the last drought, he counted the turnings the way he'd counted them in his head every night for 2 weeks. The gold had been moved 3 nights ago. Ned had done it in the way Littlefinger had taught him, which was irony of the purest kind. He had authorized 3 separate expenditures from the Crown Treasury over 3 nights, each routed to a Manderley trading company registered in White Harbor under the name of a shipper who serviced the northern wool trade. The expenditures were documented as Northern Coastal Fortification Materials, pre-winter procurement, signed with the hand seal, filed in the correct ledger, each transfer within the legal range of Hand's discretionary authority, no single one large enough to flag an immediate audit. The gold had arrived at Dock 9 2 days before Ned wrote the Raven to Greywater watch. It was already below decks, packed in wool bales, when the Manderley cog ran up its Bravo Sea merchant flag and settled in for what the harbor master's log recorded as a routine 3-day layover. When Ned and his daughters reached the harbor, the money had been waiting longer than the ship. The Street of Looms was 4 minutes from the waterfront. It was narrow and poorly lit, the buildings pressing close enough that 2 men could not walk abreast without their shoulders touching the walls on either side. Ned moved fast. Arya matched him. Ser Roderick brought up the rear with his hand resting on his sword hilt, in the way of a man who was not looking for trouble, but had made his peace with finding it. The Lannister guard was standing at the intersection where the Street of Looms met the Tanner's Cut. Not a gold cloak. A Lannister man, Crimson cloak, the lion pin at the shoulder, standing in a spot he had absolutely no official reason to occupy at this hour on this street. He was looking the wrong way when Ned rounded the corner, and he turned, and the torchlight caught Ned's face. His hand went to his horn. Ned closed the distance in 4 steps. The motion was not dramatic. It was the motion of a man performing a necessary task, fast, precise, quiet. The guard folded. Ned stepped over him and did not stop moving. He heard Sansa's breath behind him, the sharp inward catch of a person who had never seen that before. He did not turn around. He did not explain. Explanations were for after, if after came, and right now the harbor was 3 minutes away and the calculation was straightforward. Arya said nothing. He heard her step over the body without breaking stride. He heard the specific quality of her silence. Not shock, not the refusal to process, but the deliberate filing of information for later. She was storing it the way she stored everything, carefully, without editorializing, for use when it became relevant. He recognized it because Lyanna had done the same thing. Sansa did not step over the body. She went around it, pressing against the wall, and he heard her breathing change. Shallower, controlled, the kind of breath a person made when they were deciding not to be sick in a back street. He respected that too. It was its own kind of strength. The man had a family. Ned knew it the way he always knew it, the way he had known it about every man he had ever killed in battle or in the field. You did not escape knowing it. You only decided what you did with the knowing, and what Ned did was carry it and keep moving, because stopping served no one, not the dead man, not his family, not the children walking behind him in the dark. Dock 9. 2 gold cloaks stood at the base of the pier, not blocking it, positioned near the far end of the adjacent dock, angled so they could see anyone approaching from the harbor road. They had the relaxed posture of men on a rotation they had run 100 times, looking for nothing in particular. They saw Ned coming from 40 feet. He did not slow. He did not alter his path or his bearing. He walked directly toward them, with the hand's seal ring turned outward on his right hand, visible in the pier lantern's light, and the particular quality of movement that came from spending 35 years as a lord, not aggressive, not hurried, simply the movement of a man who did not expect to be stopped, because men of his station were not stopped. He told them he was executing a royal treasury transfer under night order. He told them they could return to their rotation. He told them this the way he told garrison captains things in Winterfell, not unkindly, but without the inflection that invited discussion. The senior of the two looked at the seal, looked at Ned's face, looked at Ser Roderick, who looked like exactly what he was, a Stark household man who had been doing this particular kind of work for 30 years and found all of it tedious. They stepped aside, the gangplank, the girls ahead, Sir Roderick behind, the captain, a broad, gray-bearded white harbor man named Eric, who had his wife's portrait nailed to the inside of the wheelhouse door and who had not asked a single question about the cargo in the wool bales, appeared at the rail, looked at Ned's face, and went to wake his crew. Ned paused. 1 beat. His hand on the gangplank rope, the harbor at his back, King's Landing across the water behind him, the Red Keep's towers lit against the pre-dawn black, the city dark below them, the lights of the Street of Sisters visible from the harbor road. He had hated this city from the first week he'd spent in it. He had wanted to leave since the moment he arrived. The wanting had cost him nothing. Leaving, it turned out, cost considerably more. He boarded. The city shrank. Sansa stood at the stern and watched it go without speaking. Her hair was still loose. She had stopped fighting the fury, not abandoned it, just set it down temporarily in the way that people set down things that were too heavy to carry while standing on moving water in the dark. What remained in its place was not acceptance. It was the absence of options, which was a different thing entirely, and which Sansa Stark at 13 was old enough to know the difference. Ned sat beside her when the harbor lights were small enough that King's Landing looked like a city instead of a collection of specific terrible rooms. He did not explain. He did not frame it as sacrifice or wisdom. He said the only thing that was true enough to be worth saying. Someday you will understand that I saved your life tonight. Until then, I ask you to trust me. Sansa looked at the water. She said nothing. Her anger was real. He could feel it coming off her the way cold came off Winterfell's stone walls in February, steady and impersonal and not directed at him specifically, just radiating. Her relief was underneath it somewhere. She didn't know what to do with either of them, and he didn't ask her to. Arya was at the bow. She had not been at the stern. She stood with her hands on the rail, leaning out over the dark water, looking forward the way she always looked forward. already done with what was behind her, already in the next thing. Her hands were empty. Ned watched her from across the deck and saw it. The absence where the direwolf should have been, the space at her left leg where Nymeria had walked for months. The absence that she was not acknowledging, because acknowledging it would cost something she did not have budget for tonight. She stood alone and looked north and did not look back. At the eastern edge of the harbor, before the last light of the city disappeared behind the headland, a rider came at full gallop down the harbor road from the direction of the Red Keep. He pulled up at the waterfront, looked out. The Braavosi flag was already too far to read, the cog already beyond the breakwater, already moving north on the pre-dawn tide. The rider turned his horse and went back the way he came. On the deck of the cog, Ned watched the harbor road until it vanished. Then he turned north. The narrow sea stretched ahead of them, gray and cold and open, and somewhere up the coast beyond the Vale and the Sisters and the Bay of Seals, White Harbor was waiting. 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks before anything could be known for certain. He went below. The birds stopped singing at midday, and Jon was the only one who noticed. The other recruits did not notice because the other recruits were not the kind of men who paid attention to birds. They were poachers and debtors, and men who had done things that required them to travel far enough north that the things stopped following them, and they were focused on their feet and their empty stomachs and the way the road was narrowing. Yoren walked ahead with his staff and his permanent expression of a man who had been dealing with exactly this level of difficulty for 30 years, and had made his peace with it. Jon noticed because he had been raised in Winterfell, where his father had taught him and Robb and Theon. In that particular offhand way Ned Stark taught things, not as lessons but as observations that lodged themselves permanently. That terrain communicated constantly, and a man who stopped listening was a man who had decided he didn't need to know what was coming. The birds in the neck were everywhere south of Moat Cailin. They were in the reeds on both sides of the Causeway Road, and in the branches of the twisted trees that grew out of the bog at wrong angles, and they were loud and constant, and had been loud and constant for 3 days of walking. Now they were not. Ghost walked beside him on the right side, away from the edge. The direwolf had been pressing close since morning, not anxiously, not in the way that signaled fear, but with the specific quality of attentiveness that meant he had already processed something Jon hadn't. His eyes moved along the reed line and didn't settle. Jon filed this away and kept walking and said nothing. The recruits woke in the early hours to find themselves bound. It was not violent, that was the strange part. Not the binding itself, but the way it had been accomplished, because no one had heard anything and the fire was still burning at half its height, and there was no sign of a fight or a struggle or a moment where resistance had been possible and overcome. The ropes were already there. The gags were cloth, not rough. The Cranogmen had moved through the camp like weather. Jon was the exception. He was sitting upright, back against a tree that grew out of the bank at a 45-degree angle over dark water, wrists unbound. His hand had gone to his hip when he came fully awake, reaching for a blade that wasn't there, finding the empty space where a sword should have been, registering the absence as information. He had nothing. Ghost stood at the edge of the firelight, very still. 3 Cranogmen stood at the perimeter of the camp's firelight, not blocking anything, simply present the way walls were present. Yoren was on his feet, knife drawn. He was a tough old man, and not afraid of the dark, and not afraid of the marsh, and not afraid of what he couldn't see, which was a quality Jon had come to respect in the 2 weeks he'd spent walking behind him. He was facing a figure across the dying fire who had just lowered his hood. Howland Reed was not what the songs suggested about the Cranogmen. The songs, when they mentioned Cranogmen at all, which was rarely, implied something almost monstrous. Bogmen, mudmen, something between human and marsh. The man across the fire was small and gray-green in his cloak, and had the kind of stillness that came not from slowness, but from economy. He moved nothing that didn't need moving. His eyes were clear. He slid something across the ground between them without stepping closer. A sealed letter, the black lizard lion of House Reed pressed in gray wax. Yoren picked it up with his free hand. Read it once. Read it again. The knife did not move. His jaw worked once in the way of a man absorbing unwelcome information and deciding what posture to take toward it. Then he sheathed the knife. The Night's Watch will have its recruits, Howland Reed said. His voice was quiet and carried no particular inflection. Not a threat, not an apology, simply a statement of what was true and what was about to happen. It will not have this one. Yoren looked at Jon across the fire. The look lasted several seconds. It had the quality of a man reassessing information he had thought he understood. Then he turned away and began cutting the ropes of the nearest recruit with his belt knife, and his body language made very clear that he considered the matter settled, and would not be discussing it further. Ghost moved to Jon's side and pressed his head against Jon's knee. Jon stood and followed Howland Reed into the dark. They moved for an hour, possibly more. The causeway vanished behind them within the first 10 minutes and did not reappear. And after 20 minutes, Jon understood that this was not because he had failed to keep track of the direction. It was because the direction was no longer consistent. The Cranogmen moved on paths that didn't reveal themselves as paths until weight was already on them. They read the terrain in a language Jon did not have the vocabulary for. Tufts of grass that held, black water that appeared solid and was not. The difference between the two was invisible to him. He turned back once, got 5 steps. The path he had just walked was gone. Not hidden, simply not there. The way a boat's wake was not there. Water had shifted. Reeds had closed. The causeway road was somewhere, he did not know which direction. Ghost was calm. Jon focused on Ghost and kept walking. They came to a low structure built on something that was not land, a platform of lashed timber that sat on the surface of still black water, the structure itself woven from living marsh grass in a way that made it look like an extension of the bank. A fire inside, small and smokeless. The warmth that came through the opening was the first warmth Jon had felt in hours. He sat across from Howland Reed and the door was closed behind them, and the marsh pressed in from every side, and Ghost curled at the base of Jon's boots and put his chin on his forepaws and watched the fire. Howland did not begin with Jon's name. He began with Lyanna. He described her the way a man described someone he had actually known. Not the symbol, not the tragedy, not the woman Robert Baratheon had built an empire of grief on. He described her as she was at Harrenhal in 281 AC when she was 16 and Howland was a young lord from the Neck who had come to the great tournament and been humiliated by knights who thought Cranogmen were beneath requiring courtesy. He described being on the ground with someone's boot near his face, and then the humiliation ending, and looking up to find a girl in boy's clothing standing over him with the expression of a person who had very clear opinions about what she had just witnessed, and intended to act on them. Her dark hair, he said, the stark gray eyes, the particular kind of fury that was not rage but was colder than rage and more accurate. He described Harrenhal in the evenings when the jousting was done, the moment across the lists, Rhaegar Targaryen on the far side of the field, dark and silver and watching, and Lyanna Stark watching back with the quality of attention that meant she had already made a decision and was simply confirming it. Not starstruck, not passive, a young woman looking at a choice. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful quality of a man describing something he had never been certain of, and had never claimed to be. There was a knight at that tournament, Howland said, a mystery knight, armored and helmed, who appeared on the field to challenge 3 men who had wronged a Cranogman lord the night before. The knight wore a shield painted with a laughing weirwood face. The jousting was brief. When it was done, the knight rode away, and no one who tried to follow saw where the helm came from or where it went. He looked at the fire. I have my beliefs about who rode that day. I never saw the face clearly enough to call them more than beliefs. Some things at Harrenhal remained mysteries, and this was one of them. Jon said nothing. He absorbed it and filed it with the rest. Howland described the Tower of Joy, not the battle outside, not the part the songs had made into legend, the sword of the morning and the 3 Kingsguard and Ned Stark's honor, but the door. Standing at the door and hearing what was behind it, Ned going up the stairs and the long time before he came back down. The sound of a child. The specific silence of a man who had just received the weight of something he would carry for the rest of his life. Visible on Ned Stark's face when he came through the door with a child wrapped in a cloak the color of blood. Lyanna had already been gone for 20 minutes when Howland saw the child. Your mother's name was Lyanna Stark, Howland said. Your father's name was Rhaegar Targaryen. Your true name is Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. You are the lawful issue of a secret but legitimate marriage. You are the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The fire shifted. A log settled. The structure moved imperceptibly on the water beneath them. Jon said nothing for a long time. Then, that is a very good story. Flat. Not dismissive. Careful. The voice of someone who had spent his entire life understanding that stories people told about you were almost never accurate and sometimes worse than nothing. Bastard of Winterfell was a story. He knew what it cost. The story. He was not going to step into a different one, because a man in a marsh had said it was true. Howland looked at Ghost. "Ghost is a white direwolf," he said. "Direwolves belong to House Stark. You found him south of the wall, where direwolves have not been seen in centuries. He has never left your side, not once in the weeks since you found him. What does that tell you about your blood?" Jon looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at the fire. "That I'm a Stark," Jon said. "Half." Howland's voice did not change. "The other half built the greatest empire this world has ever seen, and burned for it, and died on a river in the rain to give you to it." Ghost put his head on Jon's knee, the same weight as before, the same warmth. Jon sat in the dark for a long time and did not speak. The anger that moved through him had no shape and no target. Not Howland, not Ned, not Rhaegar Targaryen, who was 15 years dead. Just rage at the structure of it, at the 17 years of Bastard's table and Bastard's silence, and the face Ned had made every time Jon asked about his mother. The face that Jon had read as grief and now understood was also guilt, and also love, and also the specific expression of a man lying to protect someone who could not know they were being protected. He had watched that face 100 times and loved it and trusted it, and it had been carrying this the entire time. He let the anger run until it ran out. It took a while. "I want to look him in the eyes," Jon said finally. "I want to stand in front of him and ask him why." "That seems fair," Howland said. "I'm not saying I believe you. That also seems fair." Ghost stood, stretched in the deliberate way of a wolf who had decided that the next thing was motion. He moved to the door and looked back at Jon, not impatiently, but with the quality of an animal who had known where they were going before anyone had said anything out loud. Jon stood. He pulled his traveling cloak tight. "North," he said. "North," said Howland Reed. Ghost led the way into the dark. White Harbor appeared through gray morning fog on the 21st day. Ned stood at the bow and watched it resolve from mist into stone. The new castle on its promontory, the city walls below it, the harbor mouth opening between twin headlands that caught the early light and held it in the way northern stone always held light reluctantly, without warmth. The White Knife River moving dark through the lower city, the smell of salt and fish and cold water coming off the bay. Home. Not his home, but north of the neck, which was close enough that his body recognized it, and some tension in his chest that had been there for 6 months eased by a fraction. The captain said nothing as they came in. He had said very little for 21 days. He was a White Harbor man returning to his wife and his city and his ordinary life, and he had carried 3 passengers and a hold full of gold, and asked no questions. And Ned respected that the way he respected all functional loyalty, completely and without needing to name it. He sent word ahead through the harbor master. One raven sent from the ship before they docked. Lord Stark requests a private audience in the Merman's court. His maester, Sir Roderick Cassel, and Lord Manderley only. Tonight. Sansa and Arya were given chambers in the new castle's eastern wing before noon. Arya asked immediately where the training yard was. Sansa sat in the window of her room and looked at the harbor without speaking, and Ned left her to it, because some things needed space more than they needed attention, and Sansa Stark had always known her own mind about when to be left alone. The gold was in the Manderley vaults before the sun moved off the harbor walls. Lord Wyman Manderley filled a chair the way water filled a vessel, completely occupying every dimension of the space available and suggesting that the space itself had been insufficient to begin with. He was enormous in the specific way of men who had been large their entire lives and had long since stopped organizing their self-perception around it. His face was broad and pink and arranged in an expression of permanent genial interest that had very little to do with what was happening behind his eyes, which were pale blue and did not stop moving and did not stop calculating. He embraced the performance of the jolly lord the way a soldier wore armor, not because it was comfortable, but because it served. He had, Ned knew, received 3 ravens in the past week. He knew this because he had sent one of them himself, and because he knew the harbor master had sent another, and because he knew the ravens from King's Landing moved faster than ships, and Cersei's people had certainly sent word. Manderley had been sitting in the Merman's court with 3 pieces of contradictory information and a great deal of wine and a greater deal of calculation, and he had not slept well. He showed none of this. He poured Ned wine before Ned had fully sat. He asked about the crossing, about the weather on the narrow sea, about whether Ned's daughters had found the northern air agreeable after the capital's heat. He asked with genuine seeming warmth. Ned let him finish. Then he opened the field dispatch pouch and placed 2 documents on the table between them and said, "Before you decide what to do with me, I need you to understand why I have done what I have done." The warmth did not leave Manderley's face immediately. It receded slowly, like tide, as his eyes moved across the first document, the registry, the Septon's careful hand. He read it without speaking, turned to the second, the diary fragment, Lyanna's half-page. He read that more slowly. When he finished, he went back to the beginning of the registry and read it again. The room was quiet enough that Ned could hear the harbor below the walls. Manderley set both documents down. He looked at Ned for a long moment with his pale blue eyes that were not performing anything at all. "The Stark girl's son," he said, "not a bastard. The rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms." "Yes." Manderley picked up his wine cup, set it down without drinking, picked it up again, set it down. He said, "The South will not accept a Targaryen." Ned had prepared for this. He had prepared for all of them, sitting in the ship's cabin at night while his daughters slept, and the narrow sea moved beneath him. He had run the objections and the responses until he could produce the responses without needing to think. Because a man who needed to think in a negotiation gave the other man time to find a different angle. "The South did not accept the first Targaryen," Ned said. "Aegon the Conqueror landed at the mouth of the Blackwater with 3 dragons and no allies, and the lords of Westeros said the same thing you are saying now. They accepted him when there was nothing left to do but accept him. I am not asking you to deliver the South. I am asking you to give the realm a king worth fighting for, and let the rest follow from that." Manderley's eyes moved, calculating. "Tywin Lannister serves whoever holds power. It is the only constant in Tywin Lannister's entire career. He served Aerys until Aerys was finished. He served Robert because Robert was not finished. He will serve Jon when Jon holds the power, because that is what Tywin does. He does not love kings. He uses them." Stannis Baratheon. This one Ned answered carefully. "Stannis already knows that Joffrey is not Robert's son. I sent him proof before I left King's Landing. Stannis is a man of law before he is a man of ambition. Give him the rightful king and the correct law, and he will serve, because the alternative is serving a lie, and Stannis Baratheon does not serve lies. It costs him everything to admit it. He will admit it anyway." Manderley was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular delivery of a man who had saved his strongest card, "House Manderley stands to lose everything." Ned did not look away from him. "Everything you have is already at risk. The moment my name is attached to your harbor, and it is already attached, 3 ravens arrived before my ship did. Robert will not distinguish between lords who actively resist him and lords who quietly provided me passage and shelter. The question before you is not whether you are at risk. You are already at risk. The question is whether you are at risk for something worth the cost." The hall was still. Outside, the harbor sounds came through the walls, rigging and gulls, and the creak of dock timber moving on the tide. White Harbor going about its business, indifferent to the fact that the next king of Westeros was somewhere in its eastern wing, eating whatever a Stark girl ate when she was hungry and furious simultaneously. Manderley stood. It was a production, a very large man getting to his feet from a chair that had been chosen optimistically, and when he was upright he remained still for a moment, which was unusual for him. He set both hands flat on the table and looked at the documents between them. "When does the boy arrive?" he said. They stood on the harbor wall in the evening, with the sea going gray beneath them and the first stars finding their positions above the headlands. The wind off the bay was the specific cold of late northern summer, not the killing cold of winter, but the reminder of it, the cold that told you what was preparing itself to the north. Manderley said, "Robert will come. He will not forgive this. He will not forgive you, and he will not forgive me for standing beside you." "No," Ned said, "he won't. The man burned Westeros for less. He unmade a dynasty for a girl who did not love him, for a story he decided was true." "Yes, and you are asking me to stand in the path of that." Ned looked at the sea. "Robert is my oldest friend. He was the best man I have ever fought beside, and he was the worst king the realm could have produced, and both of those things are true at the same time. I have spent 17 years trying to keep those two truths from touching each other." He paused. They touched. "Tonight, in a room in the Tower of the Hand with 2 pieces of paper. There is a debt I have been paying in installments since 283 AC, and tonight I paid the last of it, and the only way forward is the way I have chosen." Manderley looked at him. The performance was entirely gone. What was left was the man behind it, older than he looked in the hall, heavier with the weight of the specific calculation he had spent his life making. How much? For whom? At what cost? "Lyanna's son," Manderley said. "Lyanna's son." Below them, White Harbor moved through its evening. The fishing boats coming in, the dock workers finishing, candles appearing in windows along the harbor road, a city that had no idea that the ledger of Westerosi succession had just shifted in the Merman's court, and would not know until it was done. Manderly picked up the cup he'd brought to the wall and had not touched. He drank from it, set it on the parapet. "I will send ravens to the Umbers tonight," he said. "The Mormonts by morning. We will need the Karstark framing done carefully. I will draft it myself." He glanced at Ned. "You said the boy has Stark features. More Stark than Targaryen," Ned said. "Lyanna in the jaw, the gray eyes. Good." Manderly nodded once. "When I put it to the Umbers, I will not put it as crowning a Targaryen. I will put it as Lyanna Stark's son coming home." He turned and went back inside. His footsteps were heavy on the wall stone and slow and absolutely certain. Ned stayed on the wall. The last light left the sea. The headlands went dark. Somewhere beyond the horizon, somewhere in the neck or south of it, a boy with gray eyes and dark hair was sleeping in a Cranogman's floating house, processing the information that had just reordered his universe, preparing to travel north to look his father in the face. He would arrive within the week. Before we continue, if you want exclusive chapter breakdowns, alternate history timelines, and members-only content, check the Patreon link in the description. The story continues now. Robert's army appeared on the King's Road at the 9th hour, and it was not an honor guard. Ned had known it wouldn't be. He had known it the way he knew weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulated reading of everything at once. The ravens from Manderly's contacts in the Riverlands had given him numbers. Approximately 3,000 men, Lannister crimson mixed through the Baratheon gold, moving fast for an army with supply wagons. Fast meant angry. The supply wagons meant he intended to stay. Ned had ridden hard from White Harbor to arrive ahead of them. 3 days with minimal sleep, changing horses twice. He had beaten Robert to Winterfell by 36 hours, and had spent those hours not resting, but standing in the Great Hall reading the faces of the men Manderly had already moved north. The Umber Outriders, the Mormont women who had ridden down from Bear Island in 4 days because Mage Mormont did not wait for formal summons when Ned Stark sent word. And understanding that the North had answered in the way the North always answered, which was without ceremony or delay or the elaborate political hedging of Southern lords, they were here because Ned had asked. That was the whole of it. He stood on the battlements now with Robb on his left and Ser Roderick on his right, and watched Robert come. Robert was in full plate. The armor did not fit the way it had 10 years ago. Ned could see it from the walls, the pauldrons adjusted to accommodate what the years had added across the shoulders and chest, the gorget sitting slightly high. He was on his best horse, a gray destrier that was doing its job with the patience of an animal long accustomed to carrying weight. The Baratheon stag banner moved above him in the cold morning air. Jaime Lannister rode on his right. Ned watched Jaime's eyes do what Jaime's eyes always did in the first minutes at any fortification. Move systematically across the walls, count the men on them, assess the gatehouse structure, calculate the approach angles and their respective problems. He was not doing it dramatically. He was doing it the way men breathed, without needing to decide to. Joffrey rode on Robert's left on a horse that was too large for him and knew it. He had arranged his face into something he believed resembled menace. He was 12 years old, and the overall effect was of a boy performing a role written for a man 20 years older, and performing it badly. Cersei was not present. Ned filed this immediately. Cersei's absence from a confrontation of this scale was not convenience or oversight. She had stayed in King's Landing because she did not trust Robert's judgment when he was this angry, and because she had other things to protect that required her to be where the power actually sat. The host arranged itself before Winterfell's gates in the gray morning, and the sound of it was the sound of 3,000 men settling into position, the creak of armor and harness, the movement of horses, the specific silence that fell after. Then Robert's voice, it carried the way it always carried, not because he was shouting exactly, but because the voice itself was built for spaces larger than rooms. It accused treason, theft of crown property, conspiracy against the lawful king, harboring enemies of the realm. The words came in the sequence of a man who had been rehearsing them for 8 weeks, and whose fury had not diminished with rehearsal, but had concentrated. Ned waited for it to finish. He did not grip the parapet. He did not shift his weight. He stood the way he had stood on walls before battles and after them, with the particular stillness of a man who had already made his peace with what was happening and was now simply present in it. Then he answered. He did not raise his voice. This was not performance. It was the acoustic reality of Winterfell's walls. A man speaking at a normal carrying volume on the battlements was heard clearly by every man in both armies at the base of those walls, while a man shouting from below was fighting his own echo. Every word Ned spoke landed clearly and remained there. Robert's responses required effort to follow. He did not deny the charges. He answered each one directly and without apology. Yes, he had removed crown funds under his authority as hand. Yes, he had left King's Landing without royal permission. Yes, he had declared for a claimant other than the man currently on the Iron Throne. He was not mounting a defense. He was making a public argument to every man in both armies simultaneously, because the armies were the audience and Robert, whatever Robert decided, could not unhear what his men heard. "I would not have done any of it," Ned said, carrying his voice so it reached the rearmost rank of the Lannister host as clearly as the men on the walls beside him, "if you had not ordered the death of Daenerys Targaryen. When you signed that order, you signed a death warrant for my sister's son." The silence that followed had a texture to it, not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of 3,000 men holding very still. "Robert, the dragon girl has nothing to do with your sister. Ned, she has everything to do with my sister, because the blood in her veins runs in the veins of Lyanna's son. Your order to kill her was an order to establish your standing policy, all Targaryens, without exception, without evidence of threat. When I understood that my silence had a cost I had not calculated." Robert stared up at him. The horse moved beneath him, and he steadied it without looking at it, his eyes fixed on the walls. He had suspected. Ned had known it when he stood in Lyanna's grave with Robert all those years ago. Known it in the way you knew something a person was refusing to know, when the refusal was large enough that its shape was visible from outside. Robert had built his entire reign on a story, and the story required a monster, and Rhaegar Targaryen had been the monster. And some mornings Ned knew, on the bad mornings when the wine hadn't worked, and the grief had found him anyway, the structure of the story had not held. Half suspecting was not knowing. Half suspecting could be managed. You went back to sleep. You drank until the question became distant. This was knowing. The understanding moved across Robert's face the way weather moved, not instantaneous but progressive, each element arriving in sequence. Ned watched it happen from the battlements and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. Robb had not moved since Robert's host appeared. He was 17 years old, and he had been holding Winterfell's gates against the King of the Seven Kingdoms for 8 weeks on the basis of a letter from his father and the truth contained in that letter. And he had done it with the specific quality of a young man who had decided to step into something before he was certain he was ready, and had found, to his own surprise, that he was more ready than he thought. His jaw was set, his hands were loose at his sides. He did not look at Ned for reassurance or instruction. Robert's eyes found him. They had known each other since Robb could walk. Robert had sat at the high table in Winterfell's great hall and thrown food at a 2-year-old Robb Stark to make him laugh. And Robb had laughed and thrown it back, and Robert had loved him for it. This was what treason actually cost. Not gold, not armies. The children of the people you loved, standing against you with their fathers' faces. Robb held the look without flinching. His voice cracked only slightly, only at the end, only on the last 2 words. "Lord Stark of Winterfell stands with his father, your grace." Robert stared at him for a long time, said nothing. Then, to Ned, "Bring the boy out. Bring him to me, and we settle this between us and no one else. Ned, Jon is not at Winterfell." This was true. Jon was a day's ride north with Howland Reed's escort, deliberately held in a village at the edge of the Wolfswood until the confrontation had been witnessed by the armies, until there were enough eyes on the gatehouse that no one could misrepresent what had been said and what had not. It was also a statement. Jon was not something Robert could demand and receive. That era was done. Robert looked at the walls. He looked at the men on them, the umber faces, the Mormont women in their riding armor, the Winterfell garrison that had been here before Robert was king and would be here after. He looked at the Stark direwolf on the banner above the gate. He turned his horse. The order to make camp came from Jaime, who had been watching the whole confrontation with the focused attention of a man who was professionally obligated to assess what had just happened and personally interested in the result. The order was given quietly. The army moved. A city of tents rose in the shadow of Winterfell's walls as the afternoon light went thin. The fires were visible from the walls at nightfall. Ned stood watch until midnight, until the cold came down properly from the north and the stars were hard and clear above the towers. The camp below was settled but not quiet, the particular restless sound of men who had been told one thing about a march and found a different thing at the end of it. Robert's pavilion was the largest, centered, lit from within by more candles than necessary, a man burning through light in the dark because the dark, tonight, had weight. Somewhere deep in the godswood behind him, through the walls of the castle, through the stone and the cold air and the long reach of the night, Ghost howled once. A single sound, brief and carrying, that belonged to no landscape south of the neck and felt in this one like a marker being placed. Jon Snow was one day's ride north. Ned looked at Robert's pavilion, he looked at the direwolf banner above the gate, he looked north at the darkness that held no fires and no armies, just the cold road that ran up into the Wolf's Wood where Howland Reed was camped with 12 Cranodmen and one boy who was riding toward the conversation that would change everything. He did not go inside until the midnight watch changed. He came through the postern gate at the 3rd hour with Howland Reed at his shoulder and 12 Cranodmen behind him who moved like shadows attached to the wrong surfaces. And the first thing he felt when Winterfell's stone closed around him was the smell of it, wood smoke and cold granite, and the particular quality of northern air that had no equivalent anywhere south of the neck. He had grown up inside this smell. He had spent 17 years breathing it without knowing it was something that could be taken away, and then he had ridden south and understood for the first time that places had specific air that you carried in your lungs and missed without words for the missing. He breathed it in and did not let himself react to it, because reacting to it would cost him something he needed for the conversation ahead. The Cranodmen peeled away to the guest quarters without being directed. They read spaces instinctively, which rooms were available, which passages connected to which exits. Howland stopped at the gate to the inner yard, looked at Jon once, and said nothing. Nothing was the right thing. Jon walked through. He had prepared words on the road north. He had prepared them carefully. Over 3 days of riding, the way he prepared everything, methodically running through the structure of it, anticipating the responses, building the argument from its foundation up, he had constructed recriminations that were precise and deserved. He had assembled questions in order of importance. He had decided that he would not let his voice do anything that gave the conversation an emotional quality before the facts had been established. Because Ned Stark had been lying to him with enormous love and personal cost for 17 years, and that did not make the lie smaller. He walked into the godswood and found Ned kneeling before the heart tree, not praying, not performing, just present before the carved face in the weirwood, in the dark, in the cold, the way a man was present before something that could hear him and would not answer. The godswood in Winterfell at the 3rd hour was a specific kind of quiet, the pond black and still, the white branches of the heart tree holding the moonlight, the red leaves not moving in the absence of wind. Jon had come here as a boy when the castle was too loud. He had not known then what Ned came here for. He knew now. Ned heard him and rose, turned. The torchlight from the castle gate did not reach this far into the trees, and Jon could see his father's face only in the diffuse light off the snow, the exhaustion in it, the grief, the specific expression that Jon had spent his entire life interpreting as love, because it was love, just love that was carrying something enormous underneath it that the face had never fully been able to contain. The prepared words. Jon opened his mouth, and the prepared words were not there. What was there instead was 17 years of a face that had looked at him exactly like this. Across tables, across training yards, from horseback, from the high seat of Winterfell's great hall, and had said with its expression everything it had refused to say out loud. He had read it as love. It was also guilt. It was also the daily cost of a choice made in a tower in Dorne, when Ned Stark was 20 years old and had not known yet what it would cost to carry it. Ned sank to one knee. The motion was slow and deliberate, not dramatic, the motion of a man doing something because it was correct, and not because it would land well. His head came down. His fist went to the ground beside his knee in the way of a sworn man before a king. Don't. Jon's voice came out sharper than he intended. Please don't do that. Ned looked up at him from the ground. You are Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. Your mother was my sister, and she was better than all of us. I owe you this. I want you to stand up, Jon said, and then I want you to tell me why. Ned stood. He told him everything. Not the version Jon had been given pieces of, not Howland's version, which had been honest and complete, but which had the necessary limitation of coming from a man who had been present, but had not been inside the tower, had not held Lyanna's hand, had not heard the specific words she had used in the hours before she stopped speaking. Ned's version had weight that no other version could carry, because Ned had been there for all of it, including the parts that did not make it into any account. The fever smell in the tower room, the roses, not fresh, dried to almost nothing, scattered across the bed in the specific arrangement of a woman who had held on to a symbol long past the point where it retained its original meaning. Lyanna's hand when he took it, hot and dry. The specific quality of her breathing. He told Jon what she said, not the short version, the full text including Robert's name, including the part where she said Robert must not know because Robert would feel it as a challenge and the boy would die as a consequence. She had spent some portion of her last coherent hours protecting Robert from himself, and protecting her son from Robert, and protecting Ned from having to choose between them. She had been 16 years old and dying, and she had been managing 3 people's survival simultaneously. Jon said nothing during any of it. He was very still in the way that Starks were still, not passive but processing, filing everything for use later. Ghost sat at his knee, and Jon's hand rested on the direwolf's head, without Jon appearing to notice he had placed it there. When Ned finished, the godswood was quiet. The heart tree's carved face looked at neither of them specifically. The pond did not move. Jon said, "You gave me a ghost of a name to keep me alive. Now you want me to take up a different name and go to war with it. Not because of the name." Ned's voice was even. "Because the North alone cannot face what is coming from the other side of that wall. Because the realm needs a king who understands that the wall matters more than the throne. Because Lyanna's son, with the right alliances and the right army, is the only version of the future where the realm survives what is moving in the dark beyond the ice." Jon looked at the heart tree, at the carved face, at the red sap that ran from its eyes in the torchlight like something that had been weeping for longer than any record held. He said, "I am not grateful yet. I know I may not be for some time. I know that too." Jon nodded once, looked at the pond. "What do you need from me tonight?" "Nothing tonight," Ned said. "Tonight I need you to eat and sleep. Tomorrow you need to meet Manderly's men and the Umber Outriders. The morning after that you need to stand in front of the garrison and be looked at, because men need to see what they're committing to." He paused. "And there is something in the armory." The armory was warm from the forge that had been running for 3 weeks. Jon could smell the metal before the door opened. The armor was on a wooden stand in the center of the room. Not Valyrian steel. There was no Valyrian steel plate in existence. And the man who had built this had not tried to pretend otherwise. It was Stark-colored plate, gray and white steel worked by White Harbor's finest smiths in the 3 weeks of Ned's consolidation there. The gorget and breastplate were inlaid with twin sigils and hammered iron so dark it appeared black. A dire wolf on the left shoulder, a 3-headed dragon on the right, rendered with the specific restraint of craftsmen who understood they were making an argument in metal and not an ornament. Jon stood in front of it for a long time. He looked at the direwolf, he looked at the dragon, he read the statement they made together, not choosing between them, both things simultaneously, without apology or hierarchy. The armor did not say Targaryen with a Stark footnote. It did not say Stark with a Targaryen complication. It said both, in iron, permanently. He put his hand on the breastplate. Cold metal. Real. He held his hand there. Then he took it off the stand, looked at the construction more closely, the riveting, the articulation at the elbows, the quality of the chest piece's curve, set it down carefully and walked to the door. "I want breakfast," he said. Robb found him before the great hall filled. He came alone, without Theon, without his household guard, without any of the performance that being the acting Lord of Winterfell had required for 8 weeks. He came as a brother came, in the way that had no ceremony in it, because it did not need any. He looked at Jon with the specific expression of a person who had received information that had reorganized everything, and was still in the process of reorganizing, and who had decided that the reorganization did not change the part that actually mattered. "You were always the best of us," Robb said. "I don't know what that means for what happens next, but it is still true." Jon looked at him. He had known Robb's face his entire life, known it across the same tables and training yards that Ned's face occupied, but differently, the way you knew the face of someone who had grown up alongside you rather than above you. The face was Tully Auburn and stark-jawed and entirely, completely Robb. "I need you with me," Jon said. Robb looked at him as though the answer to this was obvious and slightly insulting to have voiced. "Where else would I be?" He walked into the great hall in the symbolic armor, not dramatically, not with announcement. He walked in the way a man walked into a room where he intended to eat, which was without particular ceremony, and he crossed the floor and took the seat at the head of the table without thinking about it. The motion was not conscious. It was not performed. It was simply where he sat, and his body had apparently decided this before his mind had formally agreed. No one at the table challenged it. Not Sir Roderick, who had known him since he could hold a training sword. Not the Umber Outriders, who had arrived the night before and were watching him with the specific attention of large men assessing whether a smaller man was worth following. Not Robb, who sat at his right and reached for the bread. Ghost settled beneath the table at Jon's feet, his white fur against the dark stone, his eyes half closed, fully at rest, the weight of him present and certain and not going anywhere. Jon ate breakfast. He ate steadily and without speaking much, and listened to the table's conversations with the attentiveness of a man filing information rather than gathering it socially. He heard the Umber captain give his numbers to Ser Roderick: riders, weapons, supply situation, the condition of the King's Road north of Moat Cailin. He heard Robb describe Robert's camp positions to one of Manderley's men. He heard the structure of what he had inherited taking shape in the voices of the men around him. Outside Winterfell's walls, Robert's fires were burning in the pale morning. Somewhere south of the Neck, Cersei Lannister was reading Ravens in the Red Keep and making calculations of her own. Somewhere on the narrow sea, Stannis Baratheon was sitting with a document Ned had sent him and arriving, with his characteristic cold precision, at a legal conclusion that was going to cost him everything personally, and that he was going to reach anyway. Jon Snow ate his breakfast and said very little, and listened to everything, and Ghost breathed quietly beneath the table, and the twin sigils on the armor caught the firelight. Direwolf and dragon together, neither one first. Ned sent the request under white banner at dawn. He wrote it himself, 3 sentences, no preamble. A request for a meeting between 2 men on neutral ground, no weapons, no witnesses within earshot, at a location of Robert's choosing between the 2 forces. He folded it without sealing it because a sealed letter implied strategy, and this was not strategy. This was the last honest thing he had to offer. The reply came within the hour. 1 word in Robert's own hand, the handwriting Ned had known since they were boys in the Eyrie, broad and slightly tilted to the right from the way Robert gripped a quill like he was trying to prevent it from escaping. Yes. The parley ground was a patch of cleared earth at the neck's southern edge, where the road widened before opening into the riverlands, visible from both forces at half a mile's distance. Both armies could see the 2 figures, neither could hear them. Ned had chosen this deliberately. The armies, as witnesses to the fact of the meeting, denied the content. What happened here would be reported in fragments by men who read expressions and posture and duration rather than words, and the fragments would not be controllable, which was the point. Whatever came after this, no one could say it had not happened. Ned arrived first. He stood in the center of the cleared ground and waited and did not move. The cold air off the neck came from the east, carrying the specific smell of bog water and old vegetation, and the sky above the tree line was the particular gray of a morning that had decided against clarity. Robert came on foot. He had refused a horse. Ned had been told this by the herald who confirmed the arrangement, and it had told him something important. Robert stripping away ceremony, Robert wanting to arrive at this the way he arrived at everything that mattered to him, on his own feet. He came across the open ground in full armor that caught no light, because the light was not cooperating, and Ned watched him come for a long time and noticed what 3 weeks in the Neck and 17 years on a throne had produced. He walked like his knees gave him pain on uneven ground. Not badly, not the walk of a man who showed weakness in public by accident, but on the slight grade of the cleared ground, on the frost-hardened mud that was not entirely flat. His stride accommodated something that the stride of 20 years ago had not needed to accommodate. The greatest warrior in Westeros walked like a man who had kept moving through accumulating cost for long enough that the cost had become structural. He stopped 2 feet from Ned. He looked at him, not at the parley ground, not at the tree line, not at his own army visible in the distance. At Ned's face. Robert Baratheon had always conducted the most important conversations of his life at close range, and this was no different. Then, very quietly, the voice he used when he was most dangerous, which was the quiet one, "Tell me the truth, Ned. All of it." Ned told him. He told it the way he had rehearsed it on the ride south from Winterfell, slowly, in the correct order, without mercy and without embellishment, because this was not a story being told for effect. It was a record being given to the only person whose ownership of it could not be disputed. He described the Tower of Joy, Not the battle outside. Robert had heard that version, the songs had made that version permanent. The inside, what the room held when Ned climbed the stairs. The smell of it first, fever sweat and something underneath the fever that was older and more final. The roses on the bed, dried to almost nothing, not scattered carelessly but arranged in the specific deliberate way of a woman who had maintained something long past the point where it retained its original beauty, because discarding it was a different kind of decision. The sheets. What was on them? Lyanna's hand when he took it, hot and dry. The way her eyes found him. He told Robert what she said. Not the summary. The full text. The part where she named Robert specifically and said he must not know, not because she did not understand what she was asking Ned to carry, but because she understood exactly what she was asking him to carry and had asked it anyway. She had spent some portion of her last conscious hours organizing the survival of 3 people, her son, her brother, and the man who had built a war on her name. Robert said nothing. His face was doing something that was not entirely controlled, not breaking, not collapsing into grief, but moving through stages of reception the way a body moved through impact, processing, each piece arriving and being absorbed before the next one came. She wasn't kept, Ned said. You know she wasn't kept. You chose not to know it because not knowing it was a shape you could hold, knowing it was a different shape entirely. He held Robert's eyes. She saw Rhaegar Targaryen across the lists at Harrenhal when she was 16 years old, and she made a choice. The same way she made every choice, completely without consultation, in the full knowledge of what it would cost. She was never meek. She was never passive. She was not a woman things happen to. She was Lyanna Stark. The first blade, he gave it a moment. You fell in love with the idea of her, Ned said. You loved her so completely that when she chose someone else you could not allow it to be a real choice. A real choice meant she had not loved you the way you loved her, and that was not a truth you were built to hold, so you found a different truth. Abduction, violation, the monster who had taken what was yours. You built a war on her suffering. You built a throne on her death. And you have spent 17 years punishing every Targaryen you could reach for what one Targaryen and one Stark decided together in a garden in Harrenhal on a summer evening. Ned's voice did not harden, it stayed even. She loved him, Robert. She loved him the way you wanted her to love you, and she gave it to someone else. And nothing, not the war, not the throne, not the Targaryens you killed or the ones you tried to kill, nothing you have done in 17 years has changed that. Robert sat down. Not after staggering, not dramatically, not with his knees giving way in the theatrical fashion of a man performing collapse. He sat down in the mud of the parley ground the way a man sat when his body decided that standing was not the correct response to the present moment, and when the argument for remaining upright lost its coherence faster than he could reconstruct it. He sat in the mud in his ill-fitting armor on the frost-hardened ground, and he did not speak. Ned sat beside him, not in front of him, not across from him. Beside him in the mud, the way he had sat beside him in the Eyrie when they were young and the world had not yet become what it became. For a moment there was no Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and no Robert Baratheon, King of the Seven Kingdoms. There were 2 men from the Vale who had made each other into brothers before either of them had understood what the world required of brothers. The weight of the next thing sat between them like a third presence. Robert stared south, toward the road that ran back down through the Riverlands and all the way to King's Landing, toward the throne he had never wanted and proved unequal to and could not figure out how to stop sitting on. After a long time, without looking at Ned, Joffrey is on that throne. Ned said nothing. Robert's voice was very quiet. He was never mine. Not a question. The phrasing of a man arriving at a destination he had been circling for years, arriving not with surprise but with the specific exhaustion of having circled it for so long that arrival felt less like discovery and more like acknowledgement of something that had always been there. Ned said no. Robert put both hands on his knees and looked at them. His hands were still large and scarred in the way of fighting men, unchanged by the years and the way that the rest of him had changed. He looked at them for a long time. What happens now, he said. That depends on you. Robert sat with that. The forces waited at their respective distances. The gray morning did not change. The bog sounds from the neck's edge continued, indifferent, sourceless, the sounds of terrain that had existed before any of this and would exist after. He stood. The effort of it was more visible than it had ever been. Not weakness performing itself, but the honest cost of a large man in heavy armor who had been sitting on cold ground. When he was upright, he stood still for a moment. He looked at Ned. He looked at the space between them. Then he turned and walked back toward his lines. The walk was different from the walk he had come with. The anger was not in it, not subdued, not converted to something else. Simply absent, as though the fuel for it had been what he now knew it was, and knowing it had removed the combustion. What remained was heavier and moved more slowly. A man carrying something he had set down once, at Lyanna's grave in Dorne, and picked back up immediately because the alternative was the truth, and now the truth was here, and the thing could not be picked up again. Ned watched him until he disappeared into his camp. He did not issue a military order that day. Jaime Lannister watched Robert walk into the pavilion from 100 yards away. He had watched the entire parley from the tree line, not close enough to hear, exactly close enough to read. He had read 20 minutes of two men sitting in mud, which was not a posture that suggested either side had won a negotiation in the conventional sense. He called for parchment. He wrote to Cersei in the shorthand she would understand. The king is broken. He walked back differently. I am awaiting instruction. Advise immediately. He sealed it and sent it south toward King's Landing. He folded his camp stool and stood and looked at the pavilion where Robert had gone, and at the parley ground where Ned Stark was still sitting alone in the mud, and at the road that ran north toward Winterfell and whatever came next. He had not seen Robert walk like that since the morning after Lyanna Stark's funeral. Ned sat on the parley ground for a long time after the armies stopped watching, long enough for the gray morning to become a gray afternoon. He did not move quickly. He had told the truth that needed to be told, and it had done what truths did when they were structural. It had not clarified the path forward. It had simply removed the path backward. There was only the road north now, only the cold, only what came next. He stood. Eventually, he brushed the mud from his knees. He walked north alone. Tywin Lannister did not wait for Robert to find clarity. Jon had counted on this. He had spent 3 nights in Winterfell's war room with Ned and Manderly's strategist, and Ser Roderick going through every possible response from every possible player, and the one that had required the least discussion was Tywin's. Tywin did not wait. He had not waited at the end of Robert's rebellion when he saw which way the battle was moving, had not waited when his daughter needed the Red Keep secured, had not waited in 30 years of ruling the Westerlands, and watching opportunities present themselves to men who hesitated, and close themselves to men who did not. Waiting was for people who needed more information. Tywin always had enough information. He moved. The Raven from Ned's contact at Harrenhal arrived 4 days after the parley. The Lannister army, positioned near Harrenhal for what Tywin had described in his dispatches as routine military exercises, was marching for King's Landing. Approximately 12,000 men. Fast. Light on siege equipment because King's Landing did not need to be besieged. It needed to be controlled by someone, and Tywin intended to be that someone before the city had time to decide on its own. Jon read the Raven at the map table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then, he's not coming for Robert. He's coming for Joffrey's throne before we can take it from below. Ser Roderick, securing his daughter's position, securing his own. Jon looked at the map. Tywin doesn't secure other people's positions. He secures Lannister positions. Joffrey on the throne is a Lannister position. He will hold it until he understands he cannot, and then he will negotiate. He sent the Ravens south to Manderly's harbor contacts. That same morning, begin the sea approach. The Stannis letter arrived 6 days later. Jon had been waiting for it the way you waited for weather, not knowing the specific hour but certain of the general condition. Stannis Baratheon had gone silent 3 weeks ago, and Stannis went silent when he was working through a problem he had already solved and was not yet ready to announce. The silence meant calculating. The announcement meant he was done calculating. The letter was 4 sentences. Jon had expected exactly this. Stannis acknowledged the documentary evidence of Jon's parentage, which he had reviewed through his own legal counsel at Dragonstone. He acknowledged that under the laws of succession as established by Aegon the Conqueror and his descendants, a legitimate Targaryen claimant of direct descent superseded any Baratheon claim, his own included. He stated his intention to serve the rightful king. He stated that this decision displeased him considerably and that he expected, in compensation for his cooperation, the position of Master of Laws. The last sentence was the most Stannis thing Jon had ever read. He set the letter down. Ned, across the table, well, Jon, he told me it was a duty he resents in the same breath as the duty. I find that useful. Ned, he will be the most difficult man at your council table. Good. Jon folded the letter. I need someone at my council table who will tell me when I am wrong. Stannis Baratheon has never told anyone what they wanted to hear in his entire life. That is exactly the function. He set the letter with the others, right to Dragonstone. Tell him to bring his fleet north of King's Landing by the new moon. We begin the blockade before Tywin has 2 weeks inside the city. The blockade did not announce itself. This was intentional. There was no herald, no formal declaration, no message sent to the city's harbor masters explaining the change in conditions. One morning the ships were simply there, Stannis' Dragonstone fleet anchored in a line across the Blackwater Bay's mouth, Manderley's white harbor cogs positioned north of the river channel, the combination presenting itself to the city's waterfront as a simple fact of geography that had not existed the previous evening and existed fully formed now. The harbor masters understood immediately, the merchants understood within the hour, the small folk understood by midday, which was when the bread price moved for the first time. Jon's land force came down from the north in the same week, not marching, not with banners and heralds, moving, which was different, arriving in positions that covered the approaches to the city's gates, the way weather covered terrain comprehensively and from multiple directions simultaneously. Northern lords, Storm Lord knights who had read the political weather and peeled quietly away from Renly's growing court toward the legal claimant. The Cranod men who appeared on the King's Road's margins in ones and twos, and were impossible to dislodge because dislodging them required being able to find them. Renly was in the Stormlands, with the Reach Lords drifting toward him. He had declared his own claim, on the basis of popularity, which was the foundation Renly always built on because Renly understood rooms the way other men understood weapons. He was a problem for later. Right now, he was a pressure that kept 4,000 Lannister men from redeploying from the city's southwestern approaches. The three-way split did its work without anyone directing it. None of the three parties could commit fully against either of the others without exposing themselves to the third. The city held, the blockade held, the bread price kept moving. Tywin's messenger arrived at Jon's camp on the 9th day, a single rider under white banner, no herald's livery, a sealed letter in Tywin Lannister's own hand, the handwriting of a man who had written every important communication himself for 50 years because important communications were too important for secretaries. Jon broke the seal. The letter was direct in the way that only men who had nothing left to perform could be direct. Tywin Lannister had entered King's Landing 9 days ago, had spent those 9 days assessing the situation with the focused attention of a man who had assessed political situations for 5 decades, and had arrived at a conclusion he was now communicating without preamble. I was always prepared to serve the right king. Define what you need from House Lannister. Jon read it once, set it flat on the camp table. Read it again. He picked up a quill. Ned, from across the tent, whatever you write it in your own hand. Jon wrote. He did not draft it first. He had been thinking about this letter since the Raven from Harrenhal. The terms came in order, clean. Joffrey yields the throne publicly, with witnesses of Jon's choosing present. Cersei Lannister retires to Casterly Rock and does not return to King's Landing without the king's written permission. House Lannister retains all lands, titles, and incomes in full, with no reparations demanded. Tywin Lannister serves as Warden of the West in Jon's name, confirmed by royal decree within 30 days of the gates opening. No Lannister blood is shed provided the gates open before the following dawn. He signed it. He sealed it with the dire wolf and dragon seal that Manderley Smiths had cut for him in White Harbor. He handed it to the messenger. The messenger was back within 2 hours. Tywin had accepted. What Tywin did next was the hardest thing he had done in a long career of hard things. Jon would not learn the details until later, from a source he did not expect, but the shape of it reached him through his camp's intelligence web within the day. Tywin walked into his daughter's chambers in the Red Keep. He sat down. He told her, with the directness that was the only mode he had ever operated in, that Joffrey's reign was over, and that the terms he had negotiated preserved the family and the future, and that this was not a discussion. Cersei's response, by the account of the servant who had been standing outside the door, was long and specific, and at some points very loud. Tywin's response was inaudible because Tywin did not raise his voice. He emerged from the chambers alone. He walked to the throne room. He looked at Joffrey. Joffrey did not accept. This was not a surprise to anyone in the throne room, including Tywin, who had prepared for it the way a man prepared for rain in a northern autumn. Not with hope that it wouldn't come, but with a cloak. The rage was immediate and total. He ordered the gold cloaks to man the walls and kill anyone who approached. He ordered the gates sealed and the Lannister men hanged for treachery. His voice went up in the way of a person who had confused volume with authority for his entire life, and was discovering in this room that the confusion had always been operational and was now finally visible. The gold cloaks looked at each other. Janos Slynt looked at Tywin Lannister. Tywin looked at nothing in particular. His face did not change. Nobody moved. Joffrey ordered executions that were not carried out. He called for his sword. No one brought it. He stood in the throne room with the Iron Throne behind him, and the court arranged before him and gave commands into a room that had decided quietly and without announcement that it was no longer receiving them. He was escorted from the throne room by 4 Lannister household guards, moving with the polite, inexorable efficiency of men executing instructions they had been given precisely. Not harmed, not humiliated verbally, simply removed, physically separated from the space where he had believed himself a king, moved through the door, gone. The throne room remained, the court remained, the room continued without him. The gates opened at the 7th hour. Jon was on horseback a quarter-mile from the main gate when it happened. He watched the great hinges move, slowly, the way structures that large always moved, with the sound of a thing that had been closed for 9 days opening again, wood and iron finding their range of motion. His camp did not cheer. He had not asked them not to cheer. They simply did not. The northern lords did not cheer the fall of cities. They watched. Ghost sat at the foot of Jon's horse and looked at the open gate with his pale eyes. He did not move. He was waiting for Jon. Jon looked at the gate for a long time, looked at the city visible through it. The first street, the first buildings, the city going about its morning in the way cities went about their mornings, regardless of who was about to walk through the gates and reorganize everything above them. He looked at the gate and felt the thing he had not expected to feel, which was not triumph. It was the weight of it, the specific forward-pressing weight of a thing that was now his and would not stop being his. He put his heels to the horse. He walked through the city without banners. This was not a statement. He had simply not ordered banners, and no one had produced them without the order, which told him something useful about the men around him, that they were paying attention to what he did rather than what they assumed he would want. Ghost moved at his left. Ned walked at his right. The Northmen came behind in the loose formation of men who were present rather than performing presence. The city watched from doorways and windows and the mouths of alleyways, not cheering, not silent in the specific way of fear either. The silence of a people who had learned to assess new power before responding to it, who had been through enough changes of administration to understand that enthusiasm expressed prematurely could be recalled against you. They watched Jon's face as he walked. He did not perform anything for them. He walked through King's Landing looking at the city the way he had looked at the neck, reading it, cataloging it, understanding what it was made of and what it required. The streets smelled of river water and bread smoke, and the accumulated life of 500,000 people. The buildings pressed close. The sky above the alleys was a narrow strip of gray morning. He had been to King's Landing exactly once before in his life as a child in Ned's company, and had remembered it as loud and overwhelming and too large for any one person to understand. It was still all of those things. He walked through it without hurry. The Red Keep gates were open. The throne room was empty when he entered, not of people. The court had assembled, the lords and functionaries and household staff who needed to be present for whatever came next, and had positioned themselves along the walls in the careful arrangement of people who were not entirely sure where they should be standing. But the room had the quality of an empty room regardless of the bodies in it, the way rooms took their energy from their centers, and this room's center was a thing on a dais that had not been occupied in 9 days. Jon walked up the center of the hall. His footsteps were the only sound. The court watched him and said nothing, and he walked through there watching without acknowledging it, without performing indifference to it, simply moving through the room toward the thing at its end. The Iron Throne, he had known what it looked like. Every child in Westeros knew what it looked like. The 1,000 swords of defeated kings melted and shaped by dragonfire into something that was not comfortable by design, that cut the careless and maimed the unworthy and had, by reasonable count, drawn the blood of half the kings who had ever sat on it. He had known the image. The image had not prepared him for the weight the actual object had in actual space, the way it occupied the room beyond its physical dimensions, the way everything in the hall arranged itself in relation to it, whether or not the people doing the arranging understood that was what they were doing. He walked up the steps of the dais and stood before it. He put his hand on one of the swords, a blade near the right arm of the seat, dark metal, old, the edge still present after 300 years in the way that Valyrian-worked metal held edges, cold. He held his hand there and read the throne the way he read rooms and terrain, and the faces of men deciding whether to follow someone. what it was made of, what it required. The court waited. He was aware of them waiting. He let them wait. Then he turned to Ned. His voice was level and carried to the walls without effort. Who built this? Ned. Aegon the Conqueror. He had the swords of his defeated enemies melted and shaped by Balerion the Black Dread. Jon looked at the throne, at the swords, at the specific statement the object made about how power understood itself, what it was made from, what it said about the men who had sat on it and the men who had been defeated to construct the seat they sat on. It is built from weapons, he said. It is a monument to conquest made from the tools of other people's defeat. He looked around the hall, at the faces along the walls, at the lords who had served Robert and Joffrey and whoever held the room and would serve whoever held it next. I will not rule from a symbol of conquest. I will rule from a council table where the people who advise me can look at my face. He stepped down from the dais. He did not sit. The Iron Throne was moved north 6 weeks later, not destroyed. Jon had considered destruction, the clean break of it, the statement it made, the way it would close a door permanently. He had considered it for 2 days and concluded that closing doors permanently was a different kind of statement than the one he wanted to make. Destruction said, "This is finished, this era is gone, we begin again with nothing inherited." Moving said, "This is what was. We remember it, we do not repeat it." It traveled by cart to White Harbor over 3 weeks. In pieces, the ironwork disassembled by smiths who regarded the commission with a mixture of professional fascination and private concern. Crated and loaded onto a Manderley cog and carried north into the Bay of Seals and up the White Knife. It was reassembled in a side hall of Winterfell, with northern stone on 3 sides and a single window facing west. Jon never sat in it. It remained there, in the side hall, visible through the window from the outer yard when the winter frost was on the glass, the black blades catching whatever light the northern sky produced. A thing that had existed, a reminder built into the architecture of how his court was not organized, what it was not made from, what he had chosen not to inherit. The first council met in the great hall at a long table with no dais. Jon named Eddard Stark as Hand of the King. Ned accepted without speaking. A single nod, the kind that meant the matter was understood and did not require elaboration. He had been carrying this boy's survival for 17 years. Carrying something further was not a new condition. He named Wyman Manderley as Master of Ships. Manderley, who had risked everything he had built in 2 generations on the strength of 2 documents and a young man's gray eyes, received this with the performance of his usual warmth and the reality of something considerably quieter beneath it. He had the fleet. He had earned the position. He sat down and called for parchment. He named Stannis Baratheon as Master of Laws. Stannis was present by Raven rather than in person. He was still at Dragonstone, concluding the administrative requirements of a fleet that had just conducted a blockade, and he had sent a representative whose job was to listen and report. Jon read the appointment into the record directly. He added, also into the record that the position carried the expectation of honest counsel, regardless of whether the counsel was welcome, and that this was the reason the appointment had been made. Stannis's representative wrote it down with the expression of a man who had not been told to have expressions. Jon dissolved the position of Master of Whisperers by royal decree, effective immediately. He announced this publicly, in the hall in front of the assembled court. He said, "If intelligence is needed in service of this crown, it will be gathered honestly, or it will not be gathered." He knew this was an idealistic position. He made it knowing that. He made it because the position he was dissolving had been occupied by a man who had spent 2 decades selling information to everyone simultaneously, and the specific damage that architecture of deception had done to every person who had trusted it was damage he was not going to replicate in his own administration. The court received this announcement in silence. Some of the silence was approval. Some was the careful non-expression of men who had survived by reading rooms and were reading this one. He sent 3 ravens before the sun left the council chamber. The first was addressed to the chain of contacts Ned had established for reaching Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea, a merchant factor in Pentos who had handled such correspondence before, with instructions to forward it east by whatever means the road presented. The letter acknowledged her claim. It named her kin. It said in 6 sentences that the Iron Throne had been reclaimed by her family's blood, and that the question of what that meant for both of them was one he hoped they could address by correspondence, before it required addressing by other means. He did not know where she was precisely. She had left Pentos months ago with the Dothraki, and the Dothraki Sea was not a place where ravens arrived predictably. The letter might reach her in weeks or seasons or not at all. He sent it because not sending it would have been a decision of a different kind. He signed it with his full name. Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. The second raven went to Castle Black, a royal decree trebling the Night's Watch's resources by royal directive, men, grain, arms, and timber for fortifications, effective immediately, no negotiation required. The Watch had been bleeding men and money for decades, while the crown it served spent those resources on wars between living people. That was done. The third raven went to the Citadel in Old Town, a formal request for a conclave on the subject of the Long Night, what the maesters had recorded, what the records said about the last occurrence, what the Order knew and had not published, and would be required to share by royal directive if they did not share it voluntarily. He was not asking. He was informing them that the conversation was going to happen, and they could choose the terms of their participation. He sealed all three and handed them to the maester, and sat back in the chair at the council table and looked at the empty room after everyone had gone. Ned sat in a small chamber off the hall as the evening settled. He was tired in the specific way of a man who had carried something enormous for so long that putting it down did not feel like relief so much as the absence of a weight he had organized himself around. His body did not know immediately what to do without it. He sat in the chair and did not reach for anything, and let the tiredness be what it was. He closed his eyes. He saw her immediately. Lyanna at 14 on the moors north of Winterfell, ahead of her brothers on the gray horse she had named something ridiculous, and ridden into the ground before their father could object. Her dark hair in the wind, the gray eyes that she had given without knowing it to a boy she would never see stand upright. Her laugh when she beat them to the ridge, and turned the horse to face them coming and spread her arms wide in the specific gesture of a person who had been told her whole life that this was not how young women conducted themselves, and had decided that this information was irrelevant. She had died at 16. She had been 16 for 15 years in his memory, preserved at that age the way the dead were preserved, unable to be older than the last moment he had seen her. Jon was 17 now. Jon was older than Lyanna. That fact had no shape he could hold. He opened his eyes. The chamber was quiet and warm, and the work was not done, would not be done for years, possibly for the rest of his life. He stood up and went back to it. Dawn, Jon stood on the highest point of the Red Keep, the upper battlements of Maegor's Holdfast, where the view ran in every direction without obstruction. Ghost was beside him, sitting his white fur catching the first gray light off the Blackwater Bay. To the south, the city was waking below them. The bay was going from black to gray to something that would eventually be silver if the clouds moved. The docks were already active, the eternal early hours of a working harbor, the men who lived by tide and not by sun, already at their labor. Jon looked south for a long time. Then he turned north. The city disappeared behind him. The bay disappeared. What was north was everything else. The King's Road running up through the Riverlands and through the Neck and into the north and beyond the north the Wall. 700 feet of ancient ice holding a line that had held for 8,000 years and was now, according to every piece of intelligence coming out of Castle Black, holding it less well than it had. He looked north the way a man looked toward the thing he had not finished yet. Not with dread, not with the weight of it, with the specific attention of someone who knew what was there and had not looked away from it. Ned appeared beside him. He had not slept. Jon had not expected that he had. They stood together in the cold morning without speaking. Below them, through the window of the side hall, the iron,